On this most sacred of nights, when Jesus instituted the Last Supper, the Mass for us as Catholics there, let's just briefly reflect on two things that will take place this night. Jesus will take bread, unleavened bread, sacrificial bread. He'll always have a sacramental sign about it. For the Jews, it was the sign of the manna that God fed them in the desert when they wandered for 40 years. It was a sign of God's love, a living sign of God's love there. Moses, when that manna fell in the desert, commanded that it be kept, or some of it be kept, and placed in the Ark of the Covenant. Eventually, that would become 12 loaves of bread placed on a golden table in front of the Ark of the Covenant. And every week, the priests would come along. They would eat that bread, and replace it with other bread. And it became known as the bread of the presence. It became understood as the bread of the presence of God to Israel and of Israel to God, the love of God for Israel and Israel's love for God himself. And so, even during the festival days, they would often bring out the bread of the presence and show it to all of Israel and say to Israel, "Behold, here is the presence of your God. Here is the love of your God seen." So when Jesus takes the bread and says, "This is my body," takes a chalice and says, "This is my blood. This is my body. This is my presence." He's changing the sacramental value of this from not just the bread that was delivered in the desert, but now it becomes Jesus himself. It becomes who he was. And he asks his disciples to do this in memory of me. This is the bread of the presence, God's love for us and our love for God. Often, after the Mass tonight, we would go into the altar of repose and there stay awake and pray with Jesus, as Jesus did because he went to the Garden of Gethsemane. But why there? Why is that important? Well, one of the reasons that's important is because Israel was always known as the vine of God. You'll see it time after time after time through the Old Testament there, through the readings. But for the Jewish understanding, the Jews understood that the tree of knowledge, which Adam and Eve ate from, that tree was a fig tree. But the tree of life in the centre of the garden, that tree of life was an olive tree. An olive tree. That's why in the story of Noah, the raven will come back with an olive branch in its mouth there, bringing back new life. And now, this tree of life, Jesus will go to the Mount of Olives. He will go to the Garden of Gethsemane, which basically means to the vine press, where the pickers would squeeze the freshly picked olives and make them into olive oil to give new life. And Jesus now will have that new life poured out of himself, squeezed out of himself in the forthcoming days of the Triduum. But he will also lead to the tree of life, the tree which is the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, where his lifeblood is squeezed out of him to be poured into us as sacramental signs. This is the great feast we take part in, and this is what happens on this most sacred of nights.